The obelisk was invented by the ancient Egyptians, monolithic, made of sandstone, and placed in pairs at the front of their temples as a tribute to their sun god, Ra. Thousands of years later, they exist all over the world, and for whatever reason, people feel a pull towards them. Behind me here is the Great Tasmanian Obelisk. It opened in 1925. It's the Hobart Cenotaph, the main war memorial in Tasmania. And for a lot of people, it's maybe the most sacred location on the island. It's a Art Deco reinterpretation of what the Egyptians were doing. The main column is built of granite and it sits on a plinth of bluestone. In a lot of ways, it's a piece of military infrastructure. I say that because these locations are never built just to mourn those gone, but also to help sort of establish an idea about what war was being used for. And in that sense, it isn't the first piece of military infrastructure that's been placed on this location. This grassy slopey hill here, well, there's nothing here to look at from where I'm standing. It's just grass and a few feathers. But beneath our feet, there are shadows of the past. You just need to know how exactly to look for them. If you look at satellite images, photos taken from up in space, you can see the land quite differently. Between the cenotaph on the left and the helicopter pad on the right, there's a series of dark outlines, kind of look like tracings. Now these angular shapes, well, they are hidden remnants below the surface of what was the Queen's Battery. As early as 1826, the location of Queen's Battery was proposed as a site, but nothing much happened until just after 1870, when the Imperial troops began to withdraw and all go back to the United Kingdom. And the local citizens, those left in Hobart, realised that they were on their own and they had to defend themselves. For a brief period, fantasies were entertained of this particular battery becoming one of the most impressive in the Southern Hemisphere. Of course, that never happened, mostly because people had a desire not to spend any money on it. However, the coastal defence system had begun and batteries would continue to be built along both sides of the river. The Hobart coastal defences are a network of now redundant coastal batteries. In all, between 1804 and 1942, there were 12 permanent defensive positions. Kangaroo Battery was built to support Queen's Battery over on the other side of the river. It was built here in 1885. The idea being that the two would form a kind of a pincer motion to capture anything coming up the river. Things would be in range and they could be easily sunk. Fortunately, no shots in anger were ever fired, and things stayed that way right up until when the place closed down in the 1920s. When they were packing up, they didn't really know what to do with the weapons. They were, as you can imagine, all obsolete by that stage. So they took them away, trying to be safe, and they dug a hole and they chucked them in the hole and they put dirt on top. Then in the 1960s, people looked at the location again and thought, well, maybe this is kind of interesting. It could be a tourist attraction. So they dug up some of the guns and they brought them back. There's this one and there's another one over that way. So they're here, but they're for display purposes only. The fact that people felt the need for such a thing is a reminder that Hobart Town was first established to prevent the French from establishing a colony of their own. After the English showed up, they were first in and they didn't want anyone to come in behind them. That's how they felt at the time. And they spent a long time wondering if another European nation was going to sail up the river and try something on. So this is Alexandra Battery. It's It's another one of the batteries that was built in the 1880s to form the Hobart town defence system. Now I've got this stick. I thought the dog might be interested, but it's not. But I might instead try and use it to draw out in the gravel here that's turned to mud in the rain a bit of an outline of what the place looked like from, an aerial view, if you can imagine. The bit in the middle will be the water, and the squiggly lines on each side, that's the coast. That's where the beaches and the cliffs are. But be kind. This is it's only a stick, and it's only a dog, hey? Come on. So obviously this is pretty rough, but if you can imagine, this is Queen's Battery. Over here is Kangaroo Battery, and down here it's Alexandra Battery. And between these three, the batteries could effectively triangulate, in theory, and destroy anything coming up the river. Kangaroo could sort of cover this area. Alexandra could cover this area, and Queen's Battery could cover something like that. So that gives you a slightly better idea of what they had going on here. The defence locations were all built on what was very much prime real estate, yet they've all been left to be nothing much more than public parks. There is, however, one notable exception where the location was simply too good to be left alone. Dorney House was the family property of Esmond Dorney, built up here on the circular foundations of the two gun emplacements at the abandoned 1904 Fort Nelson. As it is now, the house sits on the northern gun emplacement. It's actually the third home built on the site. The first two were lost to fires. Almost no photos exist of the original two buildings. At the rear of the property, on the southern emplacement, is the exposed foundations of the very first original house. Now the batteries down on the shore, well, they were all successful. There was never a sea attack of Hobart, but yet there was a need to build up here at Fort Nelson. There's views out to sea and there's views back up the river, but what Hobart was never actually capable of protecting itself from was another danger that came quite close and came from up there. Death from above. Nobuo Fajita was a naval aviator and warrant officer in the Imperial Japanese Navy. He piloted a float plane that could be launched by catapult from a long-range submarine aircraft carrier. In March 1942, he flew a reconnaissance mission up the Derwent River, across the mountain and over Hobart. He reported seeing fishing boats, cargo ships and the furnaces of the zinc works. The people in Hobart at the time didn't know what to make of it. He could have done more. Instead, he saved his violence for the Americans. 6 months later, Fajita became the only Axis pilot during World War II to aerial bomb the contiguous United States. Dropping 2 incendiary bombs on Oregon, he'd hoped to start a massive forest fire with the objective of drawing US resources away from the Pacific Theatre. In 1962, after the Japanese government were assured that he would not be tried as a war criminal, Fajita accepted an invitation to visit the city of Brookings, near where his bombs had landed. Ashamed of his actions during the war, he gave the city his family's 400-year-old katana. He told himself before arrival that, had he been given a hostile reception, Fajita would use the sword to commit seppuku. Over the decades, he raised funds so that American students could travel to Japan for learning and he personally returned to the US many times. In 1992 he planted a tree at the bombing site. Days before his death, in 1997, he was made an honorary citizen of the city. As per his wishes, a portion of his ashes were buried in his enemy's soil.